This message does not speak in biology, blood, or historical succession. It speaks in symbolic position. When the language says, God's second son or lost brother, it is not assigning lineage. It is describing function within a spiritual architecture. Ancient traditions used family language to explain roles that could not be reduced to hierarchy without distortion. Son meant carrier of pattern, not offspring. Brother meant parallel responsibility, not shared origin. In this frame, Jesus is not referenced as a person to be duplicated, challenged, or extended. He represents a model of consciousness under pressure, a way of holding clarity, sacrifice, restraint, and responsibility inside a world structured against it. To be called a brother here is to stand beside the pattern, not beneath it, not above it, and not in competition with it. It means occupying a complementary position in a later phase of the same architecture. The term lost is critical. It does not mean forgotten by God. It means unannounced to systems. The first pattern required proclamation. The second requires containment. The first spoke openly because the world lacked orientation. The second remains quiet because the world is saturated with language but starving for coherence. This is not elevation. It is redistribution of burden. You are not being told that you replace anything sacred. You are being shown why your role cannot resemble what came before. History does not repeat itself directly. It reconfigures. When a pattern proves itself, it does not return unchanged. It returns adapted to new conditions. What once needed voice now needs steadiness. What once needed sacrifice now needs endurance. What once needed declaration now needs discretion. This is why the language is uncomfortable if read literally. Literal reading collapses symbol into ego. Ego would destroy the function immediately. The message insists on symbolism because symbolism protects responsibility from becoming identity. Identity seeks recognition. Responsibility seeks accuracy. You have already been living closer to the second without naming it. You may recognize this in how you respond to pressure. You do not seek martyrdom. You do not seek worship. You do not seek validation through suffering. Instead, you absorb tension without dramatizing it. You remain present without demanding agreement. You allow contradiction to exist without forcing resolution. This is not weakness. It is the next iteration of restraint. In ancient structures, the first son carried revelation outward. The second carried continuity inward. One broke the pattern open. The other prevented it from fracturing under repetition. This does not make one greater. It makes them sequential. Sequence matters. What works once can become harmful if repeated without adaptation. You are addressed here not because you are holy, chosen above others, or marked by destiny. You are addressed because you already operate as if nothing needs to be proven. You do not perform faith. You do not argue belief. You do not demand recognition. That absence is not emptiness. It is capacity. Only someone not seeking to be seen can hold something that must not be displayed. This message does not ask you to claim kinship, authority, or identity. It explains why language that once organized the world must now be held differently. The brotherhood described here is not relational. It is architectural. Two supports bearing different weight in different eras, aligned without overlap. Nothing here separates you from humanity. In fact, it binds you more tightly to it. The burden is not to rise above others, but to remain unbroken among them. To stand without spectacle. To hold clarity without conquest. To keep the structure intact while others test its limit. This is the beginning of the sequence, not to elevate you into myth, but to strip myth down to its function. What follows will not amplify identity. It will narrow posture. It will explain why the role you occupy feels heavy without being dramatic, lonely without being isolating, and serious without being severe. This is not a declaration. It is a position clarified. Symbolic language collapses the moment it is mistaken for personal elevation. That is why this position is framed carefully, without permission for ownership. The idea of a second son does not describe rank, succession, or privilege. It describes distribution of strain inside a structure that has already carried too much weight for too long. When a pattern holds history together, it eventually requires reinforcement, not repetition. The first expression of the pattern had to be visible. Visibility was necessary because orientation had not yet formed. Meaning had to be spoken, embodied, and remembered publicly. But once meaning becomes institutionalized, visibility begins to work against it. Repetition replaces understanding. Language multiplies while coherence thins. At that point, the structure does not need another voice. It needs someone who will not add one. This is where the second position exists. Not to speak what has already been spoken, and not to reinterpret what has already been interpreted, but to prevent collapse caused by overexposure. This role does not correct belief. It stabilizes capacity. It holds weight without seeking acknowledgement. It absorbs contradiction without resolving it prematurely. It keeps the architecture intact by refusing to turn responsibility into identity. The word brother here does not imply similarity. It implies parallel load. In ancient symbolic systems, brothers did not mirror function. They divided labor across different pressures. One carried initiation. The other carried endurance. One faced outward conflict. The other held inward continuity. Both were necessary. Neither replaced the other. The structure failed only when one was mistaken for both. You may recognize this role not as calling, but as constraint. You feel a limit around what you will say, claim, or dramatize. Not because you lack conviction, but because conviction without restraint fractures meaning. You sense when explanation would weaken rather than clarify. This sensitivity is not learned from doctrine. It emerges from long exposure to complexity without permission to simplify it. This is why the position cannot be named publicly. Anything named becomes repeatable. Anything repeatable becomes imitable. Imitation creates distortion because it copies surface without carrying weight. The second position collapses if it becomes visible. Visibility invites expectation. Expectation invites performance. Performance replaces structure with image. You remain effective precisely because you do not perform. The word lost does not indicate absence from God or from meaning. It indicates absence from systems of record. What cannot be recorded cannot be managed. What cannot be managed cannot be exploited. This invisibility is not neglect. It is protection. The structure requires at least one support that does not enter documentation, so it cannot be leveraged or turned into authority. You may feel this as responsibility without title, pressure without mandate, seriousness without ceremony. There is no release valve through recognition or affirmation. That is intentional. Release would redistribute the weight back into spectacle. You carry the weight by remaining unremarkable, even to yourself. The moment you believe this makes you special, the function dissolves. This position does not distance you from humanity. It anchors you deeper within it. You are not lifted above others. You are placed among them, where fracture is most likely, and asked, implicitly, to remain intact. To not harden when meaning is attacked. To not perform when belief becomes loud. To not retreat when contradiction increases. Nothing here asks you to accept an identity. Identity would be an error. This is not something to believe about yourself. It is something that operates regardless of belief. You could reject this framing entirely and the structure would still function, because it depends on posture, not acknowledgement. The architecture does not reward you. It uses you, not as instrument but as stabilizer. Stabilizers do not receive credit. They prevent collapse quietly. The work is done when nothing dramatic happens. This is the necessary clarification of the second position. It is not sacred because it is named, it is necessary because it remains unnamed under pressure. This position becomes clearest when pressure increases rather than decreases. Under pressure, roles reveal their true design. Anything based on image demands reinforcement. Anything based on authority demands defense. Anything based on identity demands recognition. The structure described here demands none of these. It holds only if you remain unattached to outcome while remaining present with intention. The symbolic brotherhood does not operate through similarity of message, but through continuity of posture. The first pattern carried meaning forward through confrontation, sacrifice, and visible rupture. The second carries meaning forward through non-rupture. Where the earlier phase broke open-closed systems, this phase prevents open systems from tearing themselves apart through excess repetition. Both face resistance. The resistance simply takes a different form. You may notice that resistance toward you is rarely direct. It arrives as misunderstanding, projection, or discomfort that has no clear source. People struggle to locate the tension because it does not come from something you say or do. It comes from the contrast between internal instability and your refusal to dramatize it. This refusal denies them a surface to push against. Without a surface, resistance collapses inward. This is why you are often asked questions that feel misaligned with what you actually hold. Others attempt to translate you into categories they understand. When translation fails, they either disengage or grow more careful. Both outcomes protect the structure. You do not correct their misunderstanding unless precision requires it. Correction would imply ownership of meaning. You avoid ownership because ownership invites distortion. The architecture here relies on a paradox. You must remain visible enough to be present, but undefined enough to resist capture. Too much visibility turns function into symbol. Too little presence removes stabilizing effect. You navigate this boundary intuitively. You neither disappear nor assert. You remain reachable without becoming interpretable. This is why language around this role feels restrained. Over-explanation would harden the outline. Hard outlines invite imitation. Imitation drains weight from what must remain dense. Density cannot be copied. It can only be carried. You carry it by staying internally consistent even when external signals fluctuate. You may feel the strain of this as a kind of quiet seriousness that never resolves into climax. There is no release through declaration, no completion through recognition. The work completes itself each time something does not fracture that otherwise would have. These non-events accumulate invisibly. Over time, they matter more than any visible act. The symbolic relationship described here does not demand reverence toward the past. It demands accuracy in the present. The first phase established a way of standing under extreme pressure. The second phase tests whether that way can survive saturation, repetition, and dilution. Your role exists because survival under those conditions requires restraint more than courage. Nothing here grants moral authority. Moral authority would invite comparison. Comparison would distort alignment. You are not better, purer, or closer to truth. You are simply positioned where misalignment cannot hide comfortably. That discomfort initiates correction without instruction. You're not here by chance. Feel the pull? Tap join to unlock truth, purpose, and a tribe that gets it. This is more than a membership, it's your calling. This part of the sequence clarifies the cost. You do not receive confirmation that you are doing anything right. You do not receive feedback that something was preserved because of you. Preservation leaves no evidence. That absence is the burden. You continue without proof because proof would turn function into identity. The structure does not require your belief. It requires your steadiness. As long as you remain uninvested in being seen as anything special, the position holds. The moment it becomes personal, it collapses. This is not a calling to accept. It is a constraint to respect. The structure you stand within is tested most severely when clarity becomes common and meaning becomes diluted. When everyone has language, few have coherence. This is where the second position bears its full weight. It does not introduce new teaching. It prevents existing meaning from being hollowed out by repetition. That prevention is quiet, continuous, and largely invisible, which is why it is often mistaken for absence. You may notice that environments saturated with belief language feel unstable to you. Not because belief is wrong, but because saturation encourages performance. Performance rewards certainty without depth. In such spaces, your presence introduces friction, not by contradiction, but by refusing to accelerate. You slow the room by remaining accurate. Accuracy slows systems that rely on speed to hide thinness. This slowing is not obstruction. It is correction. The symbolic brotherhood reaches its practical expression here. One pattern moved history by confronting it directly. The other preserves history by absorbing pressure without spectacle. Spectacle would invite imitation. Imitation would drain meaning. You remain careful not to create a template others could copy without carrying weight. This restraint is not humility as virtue. It is humility as structural necessity. You may feel this as an internal prohibition against making yourself legible too quickly. You sense when explanation would reduce complexity into digestible fragment. You resist that reduction even when it would bring approval. Approval is tempting because it offers relief. Relief would loosen the grip you maintain on coherence. You choose steadiness instead, even when it isolates you temporarily. This role is not about maintaining purity of belief. It is about maintaining integrity of function. Beliefs evolve. Language shift. Institutions change. Function must persist across all of that. You preserve function by refusing to anchor it to any single expression. You allow meaning to remain mobile, adapting without dissolving. That mobility is why the structure survives pressure without hardening. The cost of this position is subtle but real. You are rarely celebrated for what does not collapse. You are rarely thanked for what did not fracture. The work completes itself in negative space. In the absence of disaster, the absence of distortion, the absence of escalation. Others move on quickly. You remain aware that something held because it did not break. That awareness has no outlet. It must be carried silently. This is why the role cannot be communal. Communities amplify. Amplification would distort proportion. The second position operates individually, even while serving collective stability. You do not form groups around this. Groups would demand identity. Identity would invite comparison. Comparison would fracture alignment. You remain singular in posture, not in importance. The symbolic language of sonship and brotherhood dissolves further here. What remains is load-bearing presence. Presence that does not correct, command, or convince. Presence that simply does not yield under pressure. Systems sense this immediately. They adjust not because they understand you, but because resistance becomes inefficient. You may notice that your influence is strongest where no one is looking for influence, where agendas are hidden, where contradictions are unresolved. There, your refusal to dramatize exposes imbalance without accusation. People either reorganize internally or disengage. Both outcomes reduce distortion. You do not manage which occurs. Management would imply control. Control would collapse the role. Blessed by His grace? Click Super Thank You and give $20 to spread His light. Your gift plants seeds that grow His kingdom. Be the blessing. This phase clarifies that the position is not temporary, but conditional. It activates wherever saturation threatens collapse. It withdraws where integrity is already sufficient. You do not carry it everywhere. You carry it where needed, without announcement. That selectivity is not choice. It is response to structural demand. Nothing here requires affirmation. Affirmation would externalize the work. The work must remain internal to others. You remain present just long enough for responsibility to land where it belongs, then you step back without marking the moment. The absence of a marker preserves autonomy. This part completes a difficult truth. The second position is not remembered, because memory would turn preservation into story, and story would weaken what must remain intact. The structure holds only as long as you do not try to confirm it. Confirmation would convert function into belief, and belief into identity. Identity would demand defense. Defense would introduce rigidity. Rigidity fractures under pressure. This is why the role you occupy feels deliberately unconfirmed, even to you. The uncertainty is not a flaw. It is a safeguard. At this stage, the tension you carry is less about meaning and more about timing. You sense when intervention would distort more than it would help. You also sense when withdrawal would allow decay. This sensitivity does not feel like intuition in the dramatic sense. It feels like weight distribution. You know where pressure can be absorbed and where it must be allowed to move through others. You do not intercept everything. You intercept only what would otherwise collapse the structure. This is why you are often misunderstood as distant or reserved. You are not withholding. You are positioning. Positioning is invisible to those who look only for action. But positioning determines whether action later succeeds or fails. You stand where strain converges, not where attention gathers. Attention seeks resolution. Strain requires endurance. You endure without announcing it. The symbolic idea of brotherhood completes its purpose here. The earlier pattern carried meaning into visibility. Your position carries meaning through invisibility. Not hidden, but unclaimed. Unclaimed things cannot be seized. What cannot be seized cannot be weaponized. You protect coherence by refusing ownership of it. You may notice that this restraint extends even to how you think about yourself. You avoid framing your experience in heroic or exceptional terms. Not because you deny difficulty, but because narrative would simplify what must remain complex. Complexity is not confusion. It is layered stability. You allow layers to exist without flattening them into explanation. This phase also explains why you rarely feel closure. Closure would imply completion. Completion would invite rest. Rest would allow drift. The work here is not exhausting, but it is continuous. Continuous does not mean constant effort. It means consistent posture. You do not tighten. You do not release. You remain balanced. Balance is active, even when it looks still. The cost of this balance is that you cannot outsource responsibility to belief systems, communities, or doctrines. Those systems rely on repetition to maintain themselves. You rely on discernment. Discernment must be renewed moment by moment. There is no formula. That absence of formula can feel lonely, but it is what keeps the structure adaptable. Nothing in this role guarantees outcome. Things still fail. People still choose poorly. Systems still collapse. Your presence does not prevent all damage. It prevents unnecessary damage. It shortens cycles of avoidance. It reduces collateral distortion. These reductions are not visible as victories. They appear as smaller losses, quieter corrections, fewer escalations. Only someone watching carefully would notice them. You notice them without counting. This is why the role cannot be celebrated. Celebration would require metric. Metrics would miss what matters. What matters is what did not spiral, what did not harden, what did not become irreversible. Those absences leave no evidence. You carry the knowledge without proof. That is part of the weight. The structure does not ask you to do more. It asks you to not break posture under pressure. That is all. When posture holds, meaning survives. When meaning survives, systems retain the possibility of correction. That possibility is enough. This phase settles the understanding. You are not here to finish anything, but to ensure that what continues does not lose its ability to adapt. What tests this position most is not opposition, but invitation. Invitations to explain. Invitations to represent. Invitations to clarify what others want reduced to something usable. Each invitation carries the same risk, turning posture into message and message into ownership. You decline most of these invitations quietly, not out of secrecy, but out of structural awareness. What you carry cannot survive translation without losing density. At this stage, you recognize that pressure does not always arrive as conflict. It often arrives as opportunity. Opportunity to be heard, to be recognized, to be positioned as reference. These offers feel neutral on the surface, even generous, but you sense the cost beneath them. Acceptance would relocate responsibility away from others and toward you. That relocation would interrupt the correction already underway. You refuse not because the offer is wrong, but because the timing is. This is where restraint becomes active rather than reactive. You are not holding back from fear. You are holding position deliberately. You understand that the most fragile phase of any correction is the moment it begins to feel successful. Success invites narration. Narration invites ownership. Ownership invites distortion. You remain vigilant at precisely the moment others would relax. You may notice that your refusals are rarely explicit. You do not argue against roles you are offered. You simply do not step into them. The absence of response is enough. Systems move on quickly when they sense no leverage. This keeps attention circulating rather than fixing on you. Circulation prevents crystallization. Crystallization would harden the structure prematurely. This phase also reshapes how you experience authority. Authority no longer feels like something to claim or resist. It feels like something to avoid becoming. Becoming authority would attract dependency. Dependency would delay others' responsibility. You do not want followers. Followers would outsource their movement to you. The entire architecture depends on preventing that outsourcing. You may feel a subtle narrowing of what you allow yourself to say. Not censorship, but calibration. Words are tools. Tools can damage what they touch if used at the wrong scale. You scale language down intentionally. You leave gaps where others must do their own work. Those gaps feel uncomfortable to people accustomed to instruction. That discomfort is productive. It forces engagement rather than consumption. The structure here favors incompleteness. Incomplete statements invite participation. Complete statements invite agreement or rejection. Agreement and rejection both end thinking. Participation sustains it. You speak in ways that preserve thinking rather than conclude it. This is not ambiguity for its own sake. It is precision matched to capacity. You may also notice that your sense of responsibility has shifted from outcomes to conditions. You are no longer concerned with what decisions others make, only with whether those decisions are made from clarity rather than avoidance. This distinction frees you from monitoring results. Results will vary. Conditions matter more. When conditions are correct, even failure teaches. When conditions are distorted, even success damages. This is why your involvement remains light but decisive. You enter briefly, hold alignment steady, and withdraw before attachment forms. Attachment would blur boundaries. Boundaries are what allow the correction to remain owned by those it affects. You respect boundaries even when others do not see them yet. The symbolic language continues to dissolve here. What remains is method. Method without name, without doctrine, without audience. You practice it instinctively now. There is no sense of mission attached, only correctness. Correctness does not announce itself. It reveals itself over time through reduced friction and shorter cycles of delay. This phase confirms a difficult truth. The work succeeds best when it cannot be pointed to. You accept that invisibility without resentment because you understand what visibility would cost. You are not guarding a secret. You are guarding conditions under which responsibility stays where it belongs. The sequence concludes not with resolution, but with release. Release does not mean abandonment. It means the structure no longer requires your active containment. What needed to be stabilized has found its own balance point. When that happens, your role becomes indistinguishable from ordinary presence again. This is not loss. It is completion without ceremony. At this final stage, the symbolic language has fully served its purpose and can dissolve safely. Son, brother, and lineage were never identities to inhabit. They were scaffolding, temporary shapes used to describe a function that cannot remain visible without being distorted. Now the scaffolding comes down. What remains is posture, intact and unclaimed. You may notice a quiet lightness here, not because responsibility has ended, but because it is no longer concentrated. The weight has redistributed. Others carry what is theirs. Systems move without leaning. You do not feel needed, and you do not feel dismissed. Both feelings would imply attachment. What you feel instead is neutral readiness, available if required, absent if not. This is where many misunderstand the ending. They expect affirmation, recognition, or a sense of arrival. None comes. Arrival would suggest destination. This work has no destination. It has intervals. You are present during one interval, absent during another. The correctness lies in responding to demand, not in maintaining relevance. You also recognize now why this role could never be claimed openly. Open claim would freeze it into doctrine. Doctrine would attract imitation. Imitation would hollow the function. By remaining unnamed, it stays adaptive. Adaptation is what allows meaning to survive across changing conditions without hardening into performance. At this point, even you are no longer meant to hold the framing. Holding it would turn explanation into belief. Belief would invite defense. Defense would reintroduce rigidity. You let the explanation pass through you and move on. What mattered was never the description. It was the preservation of alignment during pressure. That alignment now stands on its own. You may find that memory of the intensity fades quickly. This is not forgetfulness. It is design. What must be remembered would linger. What was only needed to stabilize can disappear without harm. You do not rehearse it. You do not reference it. You continue living with the same restraint, the same calibration, the same refusal to dramatize. Nothing here elevates you above others. Nothing separates you from them. If anything, it binds you more closely to ordinary life, because ordinary life is where meaning is most easily lost and most quietly preserved. You remain among complexity without simplifying it. You remain present without becoming central. The final clarity is simple and unremarkable. You were never meant to be anything named. You were meant to hold posture when naming failed. Now that posture holds without effort. There is no next instruction. There is no identity to protect. There is no story to continue. Only continuity, quiet, adaptable, unclaimed.